So I've had a lot of people asking me about the aftermath of the crash and the tree branch through my leg and how I got out of the woods in the aftermath, so figured I'd give you guys a quick update video here. So after we turned my helmet cam on, we managed to tie a buddy's jersey around my leg, tie kind of a makeshift tourniquet, make sure I wasn't bleeding. We were able to cut my pants open and verify that I wasn't surprisingly bleeding that much. Like, I was a little shocked that I wasn't bleeding more, actually. So at that point we knew that, okay, I'm not going to bleed to death in the next 10 minutes. So at that point I was obviously hurting and uncomfortable, but it didn't seem like it was a super dire situation where, get me out of there in a couple minutes or that's it. So a couple buddies finished riding the section of single track we were on down to the road, and actually I guess had to jump on the highway and basically ripping up and down the highway looking for a place to get service. And I believe they finally came to I can't remember if they ended up at somebody's house or they stumbled onto some people that were actually able to get cell service and they were able to call help. And at that point, it was a matter of not only getting help to me, but trying to explain to them where I was at. So at that point, it seemed like forever. I think it was almost 2 hours that I laid there, obviously hurting my leg, obviously, as well as my left shoulder. And basically, in the event of the crash, at some point, my left shoulder had tanked into a tree pretty damn hard, and that was hurting me, and I was as comfortable as I could be in that situation. So it seemed like forever. Finally, I believe it was one paramedic showed up by himself and had some morphine with him and tapped a vein and definitely got me not feeling the pain quite as much, and then informed me that the piece that was still sticking out my leg, which was, I still have that piece, it was 31 inches long, just that piece alone, that they were going to have to cut that off because the only way to get me out of there is they were going to have to put me in a stretcher and basically carry me, I think, almost a mile down this single track trail to a clearing to where, a medical vehicle could get to me. So he pulled out his trusty Leatherman and basically kind of held me in place while, or everybody held me in place while he basically sawed this piece off with this Leatherman. The whole time I could, feel it moving around inside my leg. That was fun. And then at that point, I think just after that, the rest of the paramedics showed up. They loaded me into kind of a soft canvas stretcher and carried me down the trail. They dropped me once. That was fun. Thankfully, it was my head side and not like my legs, not my lower end. And got me to a clearing where there was an ambulance and a helicopter waiting. The ambulance kind of, did their thing, checked over me at that point. I told them, typical dirt biker, I've got brand new boots. Do not cut these off of me. We can pull them off. Everything's intact. So they took my boots off of me, checked me out, and at that point loaded me into the helicopter and flew me to Boulder Community Hospital. So they get me there to the hospital, check me out, do a CT scan to verify, where the branch was at in my leg compared to like my femoral artery, all that. So they knew, that it was safe to move forward with the surgery. Did the surgery, opened my leg up, removed a big chunk of, fat and tissue and skin to basically expose the muscle so that they could move the muscle enough to pull the branch out. So operation went well, pretty minimal muscle damage. I think they said it was only like 10% muscle damage because of the way they did the surgery. So, that I was thankful for that part. And spent 3 days in the hospital. Obviously that leg was dead, wasn't working, wasn't moving, didn't want to move it anyway. So, and then they had me on a wound vac in the hospital, and then when I was 3 days later, when they sent me home from the hospital, they basically sent me with the traveling model of the wound vac, which was a real pain in the butt. It was I called it my little electronic purse that was, hooked to my leg, and the tube ran from my leg and into the machine, into the tank on the machine, and it basically pulled a suction on it, kept it clean, pulled the blood out of it, kept everything, tight, and, kind of almost pulled the wound together. But it was a pain. If any of they basically sealed it off. They filled the wound with a big giant piece of foam and then covered it with almost like medical saran wrap, but it stuck to you and it was airtight. And if you'd get one little tiny air leak in that, the machine would beep. If the tank on the machine would fill up with all the nasty stuff that it was pulling out of the wound, it would obviously beep, and you'd have to change the tank out. I was on that for 4 weeks, and for that 4 weeks, I believe it was about every 2 or 3 times a week, I'd have to go back to the hospital and see the surgeon, and they would basically have to change the wound dressing on that, which was probably the worst part of the whole thing. If you can imagine, this giant wound that was probably about, I don't know, that big around, and them basically pulling sticky saran wrap with a piece of foam that's been suctioned down in it and pulling that out of there, exposing the wound. That, I'm not big on pain pills, but that was the one instance where I would usually take a pain pill on my way to the hospital to do that, because that was definitely a painful thing to go through. So did that for 4 weeks. And at that point, the doctor had said that they were going to give me a few day rest or break from the wound vac, which I was thankful for, because I was just tired of dealing with it, tired of, making sure it's plugged in if you're not moving around, and, all that stuff, keeping it charged, changing the tanks, back and forth to change the wound dressing. And then at that point, I think I went 4 or 5 days without it, and I kind of felt that I was making better progress without it. And then when I did go back to see her that following week, she verified, things are looking good. So at that point, it was just kind of a matter of doing a manual wound dressing, putting this antimicrobial or kind of, I don't know, can't remember what it was called, this weird purple foam that they would kind of cut and trim to the shape of the wound, put that in there, and then of course bandage it up, wrap, at that point an ace bandage around that whole part of my leg just to keep everything secure. And, that to me was a little easier to deal with. It was less painful doing the wound dressing change with it that way versus, something that's suctioned down into your leg with this wound vac. But then at that point, probably 2 or 3 weeks into that, I started getting these sores on my leg all around the wound, obviously from this whole portion of my leg being wrapped all the time. Those were a whole nother issue. Those were super painful. You'd brush against them or barely touch them, and it was, it was almost, I think they called it funiculitis. To me, it just looked like a nasty infected zit, but it was an infection, obviously, from my leg being wrapped up and, all that. So I finally got through that stage, and I think at about 9 or 10 weeks, it was definitely healing together. At one point she had mentioned that, she was going to try to pull it together and stitch it, but the wound was still so big that there was just nothing there to pull together to stitch closed. So she said, at that point, we're just going to have to let it heal. And it was, it took some time, obviously. It was a huge, huge wound, but it did heal up. And I think at about the 10-week mark, it was, obviously I was dealing with a little depression, not being able to get around very well. My leg was not working very well. That muscle wasn't firing. So, even laying flat on my back and trying to lift my leg off the bed, it wasn't working. So, slowly kind of into the gym, and just to the point sitting on the stationary bike where, I remember the first time I couldn't even get the bicycle at the gym to move quick enough for the machine to turn on. And I think within the first week, it got to the point where I could start making some steady pedal strokes and, at least getting the machine to turn on. And then within a couple weeks of that, I started just doing real easy little flat land, bicycle, mountain bike rides or whatever. And then it really made some progress quick. Everything really started kind of coming back to me at that point. And the leg was weak, but everything was working. The wound was basically healed closed. just right around the 12-week mark, and was kind of skeptical about riding at that point in time. And thankfully my dad kind of pushed me that, hey, that thing's pretty well closed up. I still had to keep a bandage on it because it wasn't 100% healed, but the open wound wasn't really there. It was just a very, very fresh scar that was kind of healing up. And he kind of pushed me to, hey, let's go to one of our local little single track spots. Real easy ride, just, get on the bike again, see how it does. And was kind of surprised at that point that, obviously that leg was very weak, and I was riding nowhere near what I had ridden before, but I was riding again. And it wasn't as bad as I expected. Like, obviously the leg was weak for not using it for that long, not having any normal physical activity other than a little bit of bicycle riding and stuff like that. But it came back pretty quick, and at that point it was kind of, game on, back in the gym, started leg pressing a lot, and within 2 months after that, that point of getting back on the bike and, getting the leg working again, I was able to actually leg press. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was over 900 pounds. I was kind of on a mission at that point to rebuild that leg and then some. So that was, that was huge progress in my mind just to get to that point. And at this point, it's 3 years later. This happened Memorial Day weekend, 2018. So coming up on 3 years, and other than a big ugly scar, I'd say my leg's probably 96, 98%. It hurts sometimes, it bothers me, it cramps a little bit, but all in all, it really doesn't cause me any issues. Very rarely will it hurt to the point where, all right, got to sit down for a minute, or, if an hour and 30 minutes into a 2-hour hair scramble, it'll cramp up, or into a long bicycle ride. But, I'd say within the normal realm of things, especially considering, what had happened. So that's pretty much it. Everything's good to go, healed up, riding bikes as usual still, and everything's good to go. So hopefully that gives you guys an idea what's going on. Thanks for watching.